The moment he stepped into the room, everything stopped. She felt it before she even turned to look at him, the shift in the air, the stillness that only came when something irreversible had just happened. Her body stiffened, her breath caught in her throat, and as she turned her head, her eyes met his. Her husband stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. For a second, no one moved. Her stepson, still close beside her, stiffened. The warmth of his hand had been on her waist just seconds ago, but now it was gone, as if contact alone could erase what had just happened. But nothing could erase it. She opened her mouth, scrambling for words, for an excuse, for anything that could make this less terrible than it was. But what could she say? Her husband had seen, the way she was standing too close, the way their bodies had just pulled apart. The look in her eyes, guilt, fear, devastation. There was no talking her way out of this. His gaze moved slowly between them, his wife, his son. A slow, disbelieving breath left his lips, like he was waiting to wake up, waiting for this to be some cruel misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. "You," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it hit her harder than any scream ever could. She took a shaky step forward. "Please." "Don't," he cut her off, shaking his head, his voice cracking. Her chest tightened. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes had moved to his son, and something darker crossed his face. His voice was colder now, sharper. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." Silence. She wanted her stepson to deny it. She wanted him to say something, anything, that could fix this. But he didn't, because there was nothing to say. The silence was enough. Her husband's breathing grew unsteady, his shoulders rising and falling as he stared at the two people who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. His voice was distant now, almost hollow. "How long?" She flinched at the question. She could lie, she could try to soften the blow, but the truth was already in front of him. His eyes darkened. "How long?" She swallowed hard, but her voice barely came out. I don't know." His face twisted into something she had never seen before. "You don't know?" She shook her head desperately. "It wasn't supposed to. I don't want to hear it." He stepped back. His hands curled into fists, but he didn't lash out. He just looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse, like she was nothing at all. She reached for him instinctively, but he moved away. The look in his eyes sent a deep, suffocating dread through her chest. This was it. This was the moment everything fell apart, and nothing she said would ever put it back together. The marriage had started strong, full of love, laughter, and the kind of passion that made every touch feel electric. In the beginning, there were long conversations late into the night, spontaneous weekend getaways, and the unshakable belief that they would never grow distant. But years passed, and somewhere along the way, the spark faded. Routine replaced excitement. The love was still there, but it felt more like an obligation than something deeply felt. Conversations became shorter, reduced to things that needed to be done: bills, schedules, household repairs. His touch no longer lingered. His kisses were brief, mechanical, just a habit rather than a desire. She told herself this was normal, that every marriage goes through phases, that passion isn't meant to last forever. But then he arrived, her husband's son from a previous marriage, a young man, full of life, full of confidence. He wasn't a boy anymore. He had grown into someone charming, bold, someone who carried himself with the kind of energy she had once admired in her husband. At first, it was nothing. A friendly exchange at dinner, a a compliment about her cooking, a moment of shared laughter over an inside joke. But then came the subtle shifts, the way his eyes lingered on her when no one else was looking, the way he noticed the small things, her new hairstyle, the perfume she wore, the way she bit her lip when she was lost in thought. And she noticed too, the way his voice dropped slightly when he spoke to her, the way his hand would rest on her shoulder just a second too long, the way he stood just close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin. It was harmless, she told herself, just a game, a way to feel something again, something that had been missing for so long. She never thought it would go any further. She never thought she would cross the line, until one night when they were alone. The house was quiet. Her husband had fallen asleep early, exhausted from work, the television buzzing faintly from the other room. She had gone to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and he was there. His gaze was different that
night, stronger, more certain. He didn't look away when their eyes met. He didn't step back when the air between them grew thick with something unspoken. She should have walked away. She should have said something, anything to stop what was happening. But she didn't. His hand brushed against hers as she reached for her glass, and in that moment, something inside her snapped. The first mistake, a touch that lingered, a breath caught in her throat, a decision made in a second that would change everything. She could have stopped, but she didn't. And that was the night it all began. At first it was easy. She played the role of the perfect wife, smiling at the right moments, kissing her husband goodnight, asking about his day as if nothing had changed. She still made dinner, still folded the laundry, still lay beside him at night. But when no one was looking, she became someone else. The secrecy added to the thrill. Every stolen glance, every whispered word, every accidental brush of fingers in passing sent an electric current through her body. The way he looked at her, with desire burning in his eyes, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. She lived for those moments. Late at night, when she lay next to her husband, she would close her eyes and replay them. The way his hand lingered too long on her lower back. The way his breath hitched when she got too close. The way their conversations always seemed to circle back to something unspoken, something neither of them had the courage to say out loud. It wasn't long before innocent moments turned into something more. Secret meetings when no one else was home. Soft knocks on the bedroom door when her husband was out running errands. The quiet creak of the floor as footsteps approached in the middle of the night. The first time they kissed, she told herself it would be the last. It wasn't. One kiss turned into stolen moments behind closed doors, into hurried whispers and locked doors, into tangled sheets and breathless nights. She knew it was wrong. She knew it would destroy everything if anyone found out. But she couldn't stop. She told herself that she was still in control, that she could balance both lives, that she could keep the two worlds separate, but cracks had already started to form. Her husband noticed the way she pulled away when he kissed her, how she avoided eye contact when he asked if she was okay. He wasn't a fool. He watched her carefully, taking in every missed phone call, every text she quickly deleted, every excuse that didn't quite make sense. "Is something wrong?" he asked one evening, his voice calm but firm. She forced a laugh. "No, of course not, just tired." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. But she could feel the shift. The air between them had changed. The lies were piling up, and for the first time she felt the faintest hint of fear. How long before he figured it out? How long before the truth came crashing down? She told herself she still had time, that no one would ever know, but secrets don't stay hidden forever. And this one was about to explode. The sound of the door closing made her stomach drop. She turned too quickly, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her husband stood in the doorway, his face frozen, his eyes locked onto them. The room was silent, thick with something heavy, something suffocating. She could barely breathe. Her stepson tensed beside her, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched, but he didn't move. He didn't step away. And that made it worse. The weight of reality crashed down on her, suffocating. This was it, the moment she had feared, the moment she had pretended would never come. Her husband's face was unreadable, no anger, no shouting, just the sharp, cold stare of someone who had just watched their entire world collapse in front of them. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was eerily calm. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." Her throat tightened. Words, any words. She needed to say something, anything to make this go away, to undo what had just happened. She forced a nervous laugh, shaking her head. "It's not what it looks like. Stop." The single word cut through the air like a blade. She flinched. His eyes flickered between them, the unspoken truth settling in, taking root, tearing apart whatever had once existed between them. His breathing was uneven, his hands clenched at his sides as if he was struggling to hold himself together. Her stepson still said nothing. He didn't have to. Her husband exhaled, his voice lower this time, more broken. How long? She wanted to lie. She needed to lie, but she knew it wouldn't matter. His silence, his distance, his careful watching, it had all been leading to this moment. He had suspected something for a long time, even if he had never said it out loud. The late nights, the stolen glances, the tension that hung in the air every time they were in the same room. She had been blind to it before, but he wasn't. Her breath trembled. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening. How long? She couldn't answer. And that, more than anything, told him everything he needed to know. Something inside him shifted. His expression hardened, his body stiffening like he was bracing himself for the final blow. She took a shaky step forward, reaching for him, desperate to hold on to something, anything, before it was too late. "Please," she whispered. He stepped back. Her hands dropped to her sides. The space between them felt like a canyon, an impossible distance she would never be able to cross. His voice was quiet this time, almost too soft to hear. "I trusted you." Her heart shattered. "I never meant to hurt you," she choked out. His eyes darkened. "But you did." She felt herself breaking. The silence stretched again, heavier than before, and in that silence she understood. This was the moment everything fell apart. The house was no longer the same. Everything inside it, the walls, the furniture, the familiar scent that once felt like comfort, had turned into something else entirely. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a place filled with silence, with tension, with an unspoken truth that had shattered everything beyond repair. Her husband didn't yell. He didn't throw accusations or demand answers. He simply looked at her like she was a stranger, like the woman he had loved for years had disappeared, replaced by someone he no longer recognized. That look hurt more than words ever could. She tried to explain, tried to piece together sentences that might make this less awful than it was. But nothing she said mattered. He just stood there, his face unreadable, as she begged. "I made a mistake," she whispered, voice shaking. "It didn't mean anything." His jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "You don't destroy a family over something that doesn't mean anything." Her stomach twisted. She turned to her stepson, hoping for something, anything, that might save her from the moment spiraling out of control. But he wouldn't meet her eyes. He had pulled away, physically and emotionally. The confidence, the thrill, the stolen moments, they were all gone now, replaced with regret, with something that felt dangerously close to shame. She wasn't sure if it was directed at himself or at her. He took a step back, distancing himself like he wanted to erase every moment they had shared. That was when she knew. She had been wrong about everything. She had convinced herself this was just excitement, something temporary, something that filled the empty spaces in her life. But the reality was far worse than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about destroying trust, trust that could never be rebuilt. Her husband turned away, his voice lower this time. "I don't know who you are." She felt something in her chest break. She wanted to reach for him, to touch his arm, to remind him of who they used to be. But he wouldn't let her. He had already put an invisible wall between them, one that she would never be able to cross again. She had thought she could keep it all separate. Her marriage, the affair, the lies. But there was no separation anymore. Everything had crashed together, and all that remained was the wreckage. Her stepson exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The final blow. She was left standing there, alone in the silence, as the weight of everything she had done came crashing down. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something unforgivable. She sat at the edge of the bed, gripping the sheets as if holding onto them could somehow stop everything from slipping away. The walls around her felt smaller, suffocating. Every breath felt heavier, weighed down by the reality of what she had done. She could hear her husband moving downstairs, opening drawers, closing them again. The sharp sounds echoed through the house, each one reminding her that this was real. She had begged, pleaded, sworn that she would do anything to fix this, that they could find a way back to what they had before. But he hadn't listened. He didn't believe her, and she couldn't blame him. She had shattered everything, the trust, the love, the family they had built together. Words wouldn't fix this. No apology could erase what she had done. The footsteps grew closer, then they stopped. She lifted her head as he stepped into the room. His face was blank, but his eyes weren't. They were dark, hollow, filled with something that hurt more than anger ever could. "This is over," he said. Her chest tightened. "Please, don't do this." He exhaled, rubbing his temple like he was exhausted, like this conversation was something he no longer had the energy for. "You already did this." A lump formed in her throat. She had known this was coming. She had felt it the second he had seen the truth, the moment he had looked at her like she was a stranger in his home. Still, the finality of it sent a wave of cold through her body. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "No, you don't." She flinched. "If you did," he continued, voice steady but sharp, "this never would have happened." She tried to reach for him, but he took a step back. The movement, small as it was, felt like a knife straight to her chest. Her hands dropped to her lap. "I want you gone by tomorrow," he said. The words were final, no room for discussion. Tears burned at her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Where am I supposed to go?" He shrugged, grabbing his jacket from the chair. "That's not my problem anymore." She watched as he walked out of the bedroom, out of her life. A door slammed somewhere downstairs, then silence. Her stepson was gone too. She hadn't even tried to stop him. She was alone. The house, the home she had shared with her husband, the life she had built, was no longer hers. She had thrown it all away, not just her marriage, not just her family, everything. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks blurred into months, yet the weight of everything she had lost never lifted. If anything, it settled deeper, pressing down on her with every passing moment. She had left the house that night with nothing but a small bag of clothes and nowhere to go. The reality of what she had done hit her in waves, each one stronger than the last. The life she had built, the marriage she had taken for granted, the home that once felt so permanent, all of it was gone. She tried to pretend she was okay. She rented a small apartment, decorated it with meaningless things, forced herself to go through the motions of a normal life. But nothing about it felt real. The silence of the empty space was deafening. The loneliness followed her, creeping into every corner. There were no more familiar footsteps in the hallway, no soft murmurs of conversation in the morning, no one waiting for her at the end of the day. She had lost them both. Her husband didn't call, he didn't check in. He had moved on. She saw glimpses of his new life through mutual friends, through the occasional social media post she knew she shouldn't look at, but couldn't help herself. He looked lighter, freer, like a man who had let go of something that once weighed him down. And then one day, she saw him with someone new. Her breath caught in her throat the moment the image appeared on her screen. He was sitting outside at a cafe, laughing, his arm resting casually around another woman's shoulders. She wasn't extraordinary, just someone simple, someone happy, someone better than her. And in that moment, she knew. She was nothing but a memory to him now. She thought the pain would be unbearable, but instead it was something quieter. A slow, dull ache that settled deep in her chest, a realization that felt worse than heartbreak. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even jealous. She just knew. She had been chasing something fleeting, something shallow. She had mistaken desire for love, mistook temptation for something meaningful, and in doing so she had destroyed something real. Some betrayals don't get forgiven. Some choices come with permanent consequences. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she needed more, that her marriage wasn't enough. But in the end, she had nothing. She closed her phone, exhaling shakily. She had thought she was running towards something exciting, something thrilling, but she had only been running toward her own destruction, and some losses are forever, and this one was hers.